have here my relatively brand new Ubel A clarinet.
Yeah.
So if I come in and I say, well, it's playing pretty well set up, but my C and my low C and D is a little stuffy. What are some things you might take a look at when you examine a new instrument?
Well, so if somebody says stuffy or says a little bit like that, most of the time I'm going to be like, okay, hey, play the note for me, and I want to see like what's their definition of stuffy. Stuffy is a very non-technical term, and so, but I want to make sure that I'm kind of addressing the problem. Most issues of that nature can be handled by key height. In the most, as if we're making the assumption the manufacturer did the size of the hole correctly and put it in the right location, which on nicer horns we're going to make that assumption because they've kind of been doing it for a while. Then a lot of times it has to do with key height, or the key height of the key next to it that's not venting properly. And so I'll kind of look at that and see if it's too high, too low, if it's not going quite right. What I like to do is I like to check alternate fingerings and stuff. So like when I'm checking like the B, I'll do both the forked fingering that, and I want them to sound the same. And if one of them sounds a little funky and one of them doesn't, sometimes I can just pull up raise this little tab here and do that. Same thing, I'll do that on the E flat as well, kind of go back and forth between these guys. And a lot of times this guy here, because he's so exposed, gets bumped. And so if that one's a little stuffy, sometimes that just got pushed down a little, and we raise the key height back up again to make sure that they're correct on there. The most notorious note on a clarinet is your front and back B flat. Usually has some, let's say, personality on that note.
You described my Tosca Tutti.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's different things we can do with that. Sometimes it has to do with key height. On your particular one of the advantages, we were talking about the cork pads earlier. One of the advantages on cork pads, you can actually shape the cork pad. And so what I do is on my cork pads, especially on any of the octave keys, instead of having the edge of the cork, which was straight up and down, I will bevel them into the inside. And I will bevel this edge to right next to the tone hole. And what that does is it gives extra air for the air to escape. With a little tiny hole and not being very high height above it, sometimes you'll just hear this, and that's kind of like the air trying to get around that pad. Now, if you were using a traditional pad, you wouldn't be able to cut or shape anything, where a cork pad, if you get really good with a razor blade, you can make it like really nice and go right up to the edge, and it'll speak a lot better. So that's one of the things we can do. Like I would say key heights are the biggest thing that I look at across the board. Sometimes I'll look at the ring heights. If people are like pressing down, depending on their fingers, some people like their ring keys to be really, really low next to the chimney, and some people like them to have a little extra height to them. And I think that has to do with the softness of the pads on their fingers. If you have more of a meaty kind of like a pad, finger pads on there, you tend to like it a little bit higher because when you kind of put it in there, the skin of your finger is dipping down into more. If you have more of a harder or more calloused, or as it were, sometimes you like it really, really low. Standard across the board when I'm doing it for someone I don't know is I usually they will project above the chimney half the height of the key itself.
Okay.
So you'll have a little bit of a ring on there. Yours is a little bit lower than like what I would normally set for like a basic student model one. And if you're liking it, amazing. If you're not, we can always raise or lower. That's something a tech can easily do, is raise and lower ring key heights for people. Yeah. And that happens a lot on the back thumb key too, because it requires a lot of purchase and surface area for your thumb to cover up too. So yeah, so that'd be the biggest thing that I would look for on that. And you see it kind of like as I'm kind of playing with it, I'm just kind of feeling different adjustments and things like that too. So, yeah.
So one of the things that we commonly hear from professional players and resellers of instruments is that Buffet in particular, some of the other professional makers, well, you need to go through and have it professionally set up, and all the tonals have to be leveled, and the key heights have to be adjusted. Is that really the case, or are they coming out of the factory really more precise than that would imply?
So I'm going to make some statements that are mostly anecdotal. So if I'm specific off on it a little bit, I apologize. It is my understanding that one of the biggest differences between like more vintage clarinets and modern clarinets is the amount of time that they age the wood before they cut it. We're in a faster production model kind of world where things have to sit. Where there are stories back in the day that LeBlanc and Yvette and Noblet, Normandy, Buffet would age their Grenadier blanks for years and years.
20 years from what
before they would do it. And it's my understanding now that the average aging and curing time is around 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And so I think by cutting it a little bit more green, and we're still talking 5 years, like how green is that really,
right.
is going to affect how the wood then kind of settles in afterwards. What a lot of people are also unaware of is that what we're using right now as we say Grenadier is not actually the Grenadier tree.
Okay.
Grenadier now is used as a blanket term for any African blackwood.
Yeah.
The actual genus Grenadier tree is on the protected species list in Africa. You can only harvest it in certain ways, and basically cannot harvest it anymore. A grenadilla tree requires about 20 years before you can harvest it, and nobody wants to go through that cycle anymore. And impingo tends to have a little bit different grain structure. Still, I mean, the tonal quality I think is almost exactly the same, but the grain structure and the way that it kind of like settles in feels different to me as a technician. When I go to level a tone hole, the way that the wood kind of like shaves off of a little area, or when I'm doing if I'm drilling a hole for a pin and stuff like that, it drills. Weirdly, it smells a little different than the original grenadilla trees.
Okay.
And most people aren't going to get that because they don't, not drilling holes in the clarinets like I do all the time.
Yeah.
But it definitely has some differences. Now, if you put in a blank room and had somebody play one that's really well set up with both different kinds of varietals of tree, I don't think you'd notice a tonal difference really. But in terms of the background and how things are affected, I notice differences. Also, I mean, there's also on modern horns like that too. Almost all of them are dyed now too, because the impingo tree doesn't have that dark black finish that you were looking for on there. It has more of a brownish with some mottled and stuff like that. So all the manufacturers of buffet and them dye the wood after.
So is that why when we look at, say, a festival or a prestige from the earlier mid '90s, it might have a really noticeable grain structure because it's undyed wood, but today's models are going to
you
be
might
dyed.
have you might have the exact same grain structure, but we're not seeing it as much.
So let's take a look at taking a clarinet and making some of the adjustments, because some of the professional models have a whole lot of screws that no one knows what they do.
I'm trying to go top to bottom and show you the most common
Okay.
adjustments that are messed up when they come in.
Okay.
So one of the first things I'm going to talk about is one of the adjustments, because you're talking about it, and it'll be on top of almost every clarinet in the world, is the little screw on top of your A and G sharp key up here.
Okay.
Primarily, you don't mess with this guy. This isn't really an adjustment screw to give you different tonal changes or anything like that. All that it is doing is determining when it's going to lift up on your G sharp key. And one of the most common things I get is people have something funky happen up here, and they see a screw slot, and they go, "Oh, that screw's probably loose," and I tighten the screw in.
Yeah.
And what happens is that lifts up your G sharp key and opens it up. And you won't even know it until you start playing. And now all of a sudden it's squeaking and nothing will play below it, because once again, this is where
It's
it's there.
the first thing.
So sometimes if you think something's going on, make sure that this key is backed out a little bit. When
Okay.
you push on it, this is the only part on almost any instrument that we're allowed a little what I call lost motion. As soon as you push down a key like down here, as soon as I push down this key, that fork key should move immediately. There shouldn't be a stutter step where it moves and then comes in contact. Up here is the one place where you want the tiniest bit of lost motion. So I'm sure your viewers won't be able to see it, but if you look right here, it moves, the slightest little amount before it starts lifting up on the G sharp key. And you want that. And you want that gap to be as small as possible without actually touching the A key.
Okay.
And that will allow, especially on a wood clarinet with contraction and restriction, that it won't accidentally lift up on it for you. So that'd be the most common one, way up at the top. The other one you can do is you can check out is your thumb key to the front. Sometimes will be a little bit off,
Okay.
where it's not pushing down all the way, or your thumb key is, because this is too low. Once again, your ring key and your thumb key doesn't go all the way down. You can't make a seal on it. That's something that you can do yourself, but you risk getting some plier marks on your instrument. We do it a lot, but the A key you could definitely check out. The most common adjustment that goes wrong on a clarinet is your bridge key.
Okay.
And that is because you're taking it apart and putting it together. That's one part that's flying out in the middle of nowhere. We have what we call feeler gauges, and this is something you can make yourself, and you can make it really easily. Mine is a little alligator clip that I have on a piece of carbon fiber to be what I like, and it has some mylar on it.
Okay.
This mylar is specifically 1/1000th of an inch thick. Yeah, so about the thickness of a human hair. And so this you can use to check any of your pads you want to. And so what we do is we put it underneath the pad in question that we want to check, and then we push down really light until the first time we feel it go, and then we tug. And it should hold onto it just a little bit. We should be able to still come out if we pull on it, but it should hold the weight of the thing you're doing.
So it's kind of like in the old days, we'd stick a piece of cigarette, paper or something in there and just kind of pull it out. That's
in
really
the
thin.
old days, they would light a cigarette and blow smoke into the horn and see where the smoke came out. One of the guys that taught me, his mentor, used to have a cigar sitting on his bench, and every single saxophone he'd doing it, and blow and see if you saw smoke coming out of it. Now, can you imagine nowadays, hey, here's your horn, it smells like Marlboro Reds.
Yeah.
No, that's not going to fly. So, going back to this adjustment here, your bridge key, its key is to adjust between these two pads right here. And so when I push down this guy here, this pad and this pad should have the exact same tension between them. And so I would take my feel gauge and I would put it underneath and pull and see how it feels. And then pull on this one and see how it feels. And this one is just a tiny bit light on this side and a tiny bit heavy on this side. And so then we would go back to the bridge key and we would either move it up or down in order to get that to exactly where it is. Now we're moving things a thousandth of an inch.
Imperceptible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the more you do it, the more you feel the tensile strength of the metal. And it's an impossible thing to just tell somebody how to do. It just comes from literally picking up thousands and thousands of them. Like I can look at a clarinet and as soon as I put my pair of pliers on there and I start to put a little pressure on, like I know exactly like, oh, that's it. And it's fine. And, you know, overshoot and you kind of go back and forth sometimes. So I'm going to let you try using this guy on yours.
Okay.
So you can just pick any random pad you want. Usually it's best on ones that you push down with your finger to see how
So just put it under the...
and then
just-
push down, and then you see
Okay.
if it starts to grab it a little bit. And now really light touch. You don't want to be, you know, if you gorilla grip it, you're not giving yourself any good information. And what we do
Okay.
is when I'm teaching people, I do.
It seems to me like very, very similar feel between
Yep,
what you were
and
just
that's what
talking
you want. If it's balanced between the two, then you're good to go.
Okay.
And I do what I call, when I'm really checking pads, I do what I call rock around the clock. And I'll take my little feeler gauge and I'll run it all the way around from every direction. And then that way I can say, okay, it's light at 9 o'clock, it's heavy at 3 o'clock, so I need to tilt the pad that
So
direction.
you're looking for those pads that are
Exactly.
up and down.
Yep,
without
that
adjustment.
are floated on that glue and they're not quite sitting exactly where they need to be, and that's where we
Right.
check everything. And if we get some weird thing where it's only like light just on the very front, but it's sealing everywhere else, it might be the pad that's bad. Pads, you know, are just like anything else in the world, there can be a low spot or a high spot in them, and in that case, we just toss them and put a new one in, kind of thing.
Okay.
So, and then the other biggest one that we're going to find common is down here, and that's the between these two pads down here. And it's kind of the same thing. You want to make sure that they are even between each other. So when you're grabbing on, they're grabbing at the same height. And if I'm being really, really picky, this guy's just a tiny bit light. And so that means this guy would need to come down a little bit, or this guy would need to come up a little bit. And our determination is based on where the key height is to begin with, and whether it's going to cause some lost motion like we were talking about here. So I would take my thumb here, and I would just push down there just a tiny bit. And that would,
Now you've got a nice even seal.
hopefully, unless I went too far, and then it goes the other side, so there's nice and tight. And if I needed to, I could raise it back up again, or I could lower this guy down, going back and forth. Yeah. So those are kind of like the 3 or 4 major things. Like it was just like it was playing 5 minutes ago, and now it's all of a sudden not playing. Assuming you didn't throw it down the staircase.
Okay. So on my Tosca, there's a couple of they look like key height adjustments.
Yeah.
I would gather on the right hand
Yeah.
joint. And what are those used to adjust?
For sure, that's a great question. So depending on what it is, the screws do different things. So this guy right here, this screw, is actually just a lost motion screw. So when we push down this one, all it's doing is activating to go to this guy, but there's no real adjustment. It's up or down. It's not connected to other things.
Okay.
But if you back this out or in, the corks that are under here, because it's a little tiny arm, tend to be under a lot of pressure. And if you don't have an adjusting screw there, the cork can then compress over time, and eventually you have that little like stutter where when you push down on this doesn't activate for that like momentary. And middle scores aren't going to notice it. Professionals definitely will. So Buffet was nice enough to add a adjusting screw here. So as that goes, if you feel a little lost motion, you can just tighten it down just to snug it up a little bit. It's not going to hurt anything. This one can't hurt anything that way. This guy here is more of an adjustment screw. So this will actually affect your key height on this guy. So when you're pushing down this one, it's also activating the guy next to it, so we're doing both together. So if you want to push down this guy, it does it by itself. This one here needs to go, so this I'm sorry, I'm not showing the camera very well. So this guy is holding it down, and that'll also kind of help determine the key height here, because the lowest note sometimes will be a little, yeah.
Yeah, this is a low F correction key that he's looking at,
Yeah.
and so it's working in conjunction with the main low F key to ensure that it's operating when it's pushed.
And that's like any note that's at the farthest end where the conicalness of the thing opens up is always going to be a little bit of a funky note.